On this UK National Poetry Day, the Hippocrates Initiative for Poetry and Medicine is devoting this entire Poems to Live For webinar to readings of poetry from conflict zones.
We're going to begin with Fouad Fouad, who is Syrian but currently living in Beirut in Lebanon. You may, of course, be familiar with the kind of story that lies behind Fouad's life because it is replicated in far too many lives, people who have been driven out of Syria by the terrible civil war of the last 8-9 years. His translator is Norbert Hirschhorn, who also has a history of migration and exile, in his case, as a child from Hitler's Germany. He was, I believe I'm right in saying, Norbert, in the Kindertransporter, where you're reading now. We're going to begin with Fouad Fouad, who, as I say, is living in Beirut. His book is called Once Upon a Time in Aleppo. I'm just going to hold it up so everybody can see that. You can order it, of course, from the Hippocrates Press, the Hippocrates website. I'm sure you can order it directly from the author and his translator, if you are friends of theirs. I'm sure that some of you are. So Fouad will read samples in the original, in the Arabic, and Norbert Hirschhorn will read the translations that he has wonderfully made together with the author in recent years. So I'm going to hand on, without any more waste of time from me, to Fouad. Fouad, welcome on National Poetry Day in the UK. And everyone is now going to listen to you with microphones muted.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be in such an event and to have my book from your public house and to have all friends also joining us here. I saw many names. So I will start immediately. القتلة يعيشون طويلا يملكون الوقت ليسقوا النباتات في الحديقة المنزلية ويذهبون قليلا إلى المسرح وعند الضرورة يبدلون طقم الأسنان القديم بواحد يصلح للقضم. القتلة العجائز تطرطق عظامهم حين يهرولون في الممشى البحري. خيط الدم ما زال يسح خلفهم ككلب أعرج. يفرم القتلة بسكين المطبخ قديد اللحم ويلحسون أثر الملح المتبقي على الأصابع. الخشب الأبيض فكرتي لوصف المطبخ. الملح فكرة القاتل لحفظ الذكريات. الطريق منكوش من الوقوع على الركبتين والأصوات عمياء تتخبط بالجدران. اليد التي كانت عصا ترمى أيضا كحبل والجثة في الطريق ليست لتلك العين الواحدة على أعلى السطح. ثمة من سمح لها أن تسقط كيفما اتفق هكذا وأن تترك بحيرات صغيرة تعلق بأحذية الرياضة.
Killers live long. They have time to water plants in their gardens, and once in a while go to the theater. When necessary, they replace old dentures with new ones fit for biting. Elderly killers, their bones rattle while jogging the seashore. Ribbons of blood dribble behind them like a crippled dog. Killers mince cured meat with a kitchen knife and lick the tang of salt left on their fingers. White tiles is how I describe their kitchens. Salt is how the killers preserve their memories. The street is potholed by knees. Blind sounds echo off walls. What was once an arm is now a rope. The corpse across the road belongs to no one, not even to One Eye on the roof, who stitches up rag dolls, leaving puddles of blood clotting on Nikes.
مقبرة هو الفيسبوك. بشمعة مرتجفة نقترب من صور أحبابنا الضاحكين في الموت، وننحني لنبوس جباههم ونشكل الآس في التراب المبلل. بعد يومين سيجف الآس وينمو العشب البري في صفحاتهم ليطمس الأسماء، لكن الشمعة ولو مرتجفة سنمر بها على صور أحباء آخرين يضحكون في الموت، يموتون بصوت خافت بأدنى ضجة ممكنة. اليوم الطلاب الصغار عبروا الممر على رؤوس أصابعهم كي لا يقلقوا نومنا، وأغلقوا بصوت مكتوم خلفهم باب الحياة الثقيل. الطلاب الصغار غدا لن يكونوا مادة لقصيدة أو خبرا في شريط يعبر سريعا من اليسار إلى اليمين.
Facebook as cemetery. 1. With a flickering candle, we click on photos of our beloveds, laughing, though dead. We bend over to kiss them and put myrtle flowers on the wet soil. After 2 days, the myrtle will desiccate and wild grasses grow over their pages, blurring their names. The still trembling candle will again pass over other beloveds, laughing in death. 2. The children die silently, faceless, bodiless, like crossing a hallway on tiptoe. They won't even appear in a poem or on breaking news. Well behaved. Anonymous.
يوميات حلب. 1. الكتابة ألم، والدم الذي ينقط على الشاشة يلوث المشهد ويترك على الكنبة ما يشبه بقع القهوة الجافة. نلمسها بأصابع مرتجفة كي لا تنتقل إلينا العدوى. نستند بظهور مكسورة كأننا ذاهبون إلى الجحيم، بعيون مغبشة بالأحمر الداكن، لكنه بني أيضا ويترك على الروح ما يشبه الصدأ. نمسح على الرؤوس الهرمة ثم نلعق الملح الذي يسيل من العيون. الذين يزحفون من طرف الشارع إلى طرف الشاشة يتركون على الإسفلت أثرا أخضر سرعان ما يكبر مثل سياج من الحبق. يرموننا بوردة ويموتون على عجل كي لا نخجل منا. اخلع نعليك الآن وامشي على قطع الزجاج. هذا هو الوادي المقدس.
Aleppo Diary, Part 1. Writing hurts. The blood dripping down the TV screen poisons the air, stains the couch with what looks like dried coffee. We touch, trembling, afraid of infection. Our backs bent as if descending to hell. Red and brown rust spots reflect on our faces. We rub our heads, turn away, and lick the salt from tears. They who crawl from street to screen leave green traces on the tarmac, which burst into bushes of basil. They throw us a flower and die quickly to spare us from shame. Take off your shoes, walk on broken glass, for now you are in a sacred valley.
يوميات حلب 2. على شرفة البيت أجلس، حلب أمامي سوداء وموحشة، قرقعة صحون في العتمة تعني أن ثمة حياة تحدث على طاولة قريبة، لا نأمة سوى رشقات رصاص متقطعة من مكان ما، وقذيفة واحدة يسبقها صفير غريب. ثمة من يترك الآن هذا الكوكب بحلق جاف. حلب أمامي سوداء وساكنة، الظلال العملاقة هذه ربما لأشجار، ربما لغيلان قادمة من حكايات بعيدة في الطفولة، ربما هو بخار أسود ينفثنه الآن نسوة ينتظرن أولادا صاروا أرقاما في نشرة الأخبار. حلب، لا نقرة عود، لا قد يميس، لا كأس في العندليب، لا ندامة ولا غناء. واحدا فواحدا يستيقظون وحوش العتمة.
Aleppo Diary, Part 2. I sit on my balcony, Aleppo spread before me, black and deserted. A clatter of dishes in the dark means life does go on. No other sound save sporadic gunfire somewhere distant, until a peculiar whistle before the shell explodes. Someone leaves this earth with a dry throat. Aleppo before me remains black and still. Those huge shadows might be trees, or childhood goblins, or black vapors exhaled by women waiting for their children, already numbers in a news bulletin.
بانكرياس. الصدفة وحدها ما رماني في هذه الظلمة، لي شبهة القاتل ونسيج الملتف على ذاته. رأيت ما يدبر في الخفاء وحفظت السر. عزلة الأصم تلاحقني وتبتر أطرافي كي لا أبصق مادتي. أقبع في صورة الغامض متحينا فرصة الذئب، كيما بعضة واحدة أفرغ شهوة القتل.
Pancreas. Just by bad luck, I was cast into the Stygian pit. I look like a killer, occult, always suspect. I watch what happens from behind the arras and keep its secrets, isolated like a leper, cut off like an amputee, crouched like a Norway rat, ready to strike with one bite.
الطحال. الصامت تطبخ الأسرار في الزاوية النائية. ما الذي تدبره في العتمة؟ ما الذي تهيئ لمقتلي؟ فكر بالكبد شبيهك الداكن. فكر ما الذي يعنيه أن تكون مستوحدا، لا طريق إليك، لا مخرج منك، مقبرة الدم، الذاهل عن سواك، ناقص الجثة من بعض الحيوان، كأنك نسيان متخثر، لا ترى نفسك إلا على خلقة المقتول.
Spleen, the silent one. You brew secrets in desolation. What are you doing in that darkness? Preparing for the next murder? Shadowy, alone, like the liver. No avenue into you, but no one ever comes out of you. You, charnel house of blood, hewn corpses, remnants, coagulated oblivion.
السرة. لا تحاول بالإصبع أن تفتح القفل أو أن تلج البطن. ضع طرف اللسان على السرة والحس طعم الحياة. السرة لو تأملتها عين عمياء تنظر إلى الداخل. السرة سر ومكيدة وشهوة مبتورة، قوقعة، طعنة مكتومة، ذكريات على هيئة ثقب، صلة الوصل المهجورة سوى أنها من ندم خالص.
Umbilicus. Don't try to winkle the lock with your finger to slip inside the belly, but stroke it with the tip of your tongue. Lick the taste of life. Think about it. It is a blind eye that peeks inside, a secret, a trap, amputated lust, a sheath, a shrouded puncture, memory disguised as a cleft, an abandoned bridge, a regret.
كاميرا كانون 18-300 ملم. ربما ثمة وقت لنسق النباتات التي تنمو على مهل قرب حائط مهدم في حارة مقلعة الأحجار في مدينة بالأسود والأبيض اسمها حلب. الكوة المفتوحة بين منزلين، العصفور المرتجف في الكف الصغيرة التي بحجم ورقة شجر، المشط في يد المقاتل، الكتب لتصد الموت القادم من السماء الرمادية، الملاك المصلوب في الكنيسة بجناحين مثقبين بالرصاص وبكاء المصلين، ضحكة الولد الملطخة بالهباب. الرشاش أيضا يأخذ استراحة حينما تنشغل أصابع المقاتل بفرط حب الرمان. في حلب الموت ينمو في الحارات الخلفية كنبات أسودة، أو يسقط من السماء مطرا من الخردة المسمومة. العابرون أيضا يعرفون ذلك، الأولاد في مدارسهم، طوابير الخبز، صور القادة الممحية على الحائط، والعجوز محني الظهر. في حلب ينظر الموت في المرآة برهة ثم يضغط على الزناد.
Canon lens, 18 by 300 millimeters. Perhaps a time to water plants growing by a fallen wall, a shattered alley in the black and white city named Aleppo. In the gap between two houses, a sparrow trembles in a child's hand, and a sniper combs his pomaded hair behind a stack of books, shielding against death from the sky. Inside the church, an angel, wings outstretched, pierced by tears and bullets, and a boy smudged with dust, laughing. The sniper sucks seeds from a pomegranate, lets his rifle rest against a wall in Aleppo. In Aleppo, death grows in alleys like a rotted plant, pours from the sky, nuts, bolts, TNT, and chlorine. Death stares into the mirror for one moment, turns, sights, pulls the trigger. People on bread lines know all this. Also children reciting in school, and a hunchbacked old man.
الترقوة. لو لم أكن من العظم لاخترت الريش، أبداً مربوط بسواي، على حافة الجلد، غير أني لا أرى، لا منفذ لي إلا أحلامي أن أكون الريش الذي على حافة الهواء في الزرقة الواسعة للسماء الواسعة، سوى أنني مربوط بسواي. عظم مربوط بسواي وجاهز للكسر.
Clavicle. If I weren't made of bone lying under the skin, unseen, I choose to be a feather. Hopeless my dream to be a feather at the edge of air in the bright blue of the wide sky. Yet I am shackled to others, a bone fettered to others, fragile, easily broken.
إلى ربيعة. الشجرة الرقيقة التي كانتها لم تزل رقيقة، لكن ظلالها امتدت كي تمشي فيها عائلة بأكملها سنوات من الضحك. الفتنة الغامضة تكسر الظهر وتترك على الركبتين آثار وقوع. لم أصل معها نهاية العالم، كنت دائما أصل بدايته. منذ أن عرفت ربيعة قبل 20 عاما وهي تحمل على كتفيها الرقيقتين حزن الأخوة، تمضي إلى سجون نائية بدموع سرية وأخبار العائلة وضحكات منتزعة كالشوك من الحلق، وتعود من سجون نائية بدموع علنية وأخبار منبوذين من الزمن وخطوات الألم المرتبكة. 20 عاماً ولا تزال تحمل على كتفيها الرقيقتين كيس الأحلام المثقوب وحزن الأخوة.
To Rabia. She is like the white poplar whose branches give shelter to family who walk years in joy. She has a charm to bring people to their knees in homage. For the 20 years I've known her, she has carried on her small shoulders the burden of lost siblings. She goes to godforsaken prisons, suppressing tears while carrying family news, with a pretend laughter that sticks like a thorn in her throat. She returns from the distant prisons, crying now, carrying news of the wretched, with the faltering steps of a broken woman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, my word. Fouad and Norbert, that was a wonderful reading. That was immensely vivid and moving and affecting. And I would say more, but we have a second reader. And everybody else, plenty of time for questions after our second reader today has read as well. But thank you so much. That was marvelous. Now you, of course, both of you are doctor poets, and this is a distinguished lineage, one could say, one that reaches across the world. One can immediately think of William Carlos Williams, Godfrey Benn, Danny Absey, Peter Goldsworthy. There are many writers at various times all around the world who have been doctor poets. It's a wonderful tradition. And our next reader is also a doctor poet. So this is Andrew Dimitri's book, Winter in Northern Iraq. I'll let Andy speak for himself, but I'll just say to all of you that he is a pulmonologist in Sydney, but he does a lot of work around the world with Médecins Sans Frontières. And the book that the Hippocrates Press published was his poems that came from work creating a new rapid response, I'll call it, hospital, while the last battle to drive ISIS out of Mosul was happening. But since then, Andy has been in other crisis areas around the world. He's going to be reading new poems as well this evening. So please welcome Andrew Dimitri. Over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael and Donald, for having me here, and also to Fouad and Norbert for those incredibly moving. I've been working with Doctors Without Borders for about 10 years now, all over the world, in various places, coming intermittently and coming back to Sydney in between times. I'm just going to finish off with a couple of poems from the book Winter in Northern Iraq, which I have read from a number of times in the past. I thought I'd read some new poetry today, but I'll read a poem from here called It Will Make a Fine Hospital, which was which is the runner-up in the 2017 Hippocrates Prize, and was also the Guardian Poem of the Week, Guardian newspaper Poem of the Week a couple of years ago. And it's about setting up a trauma hospital, a trauma post quite close to Mosul, which was a city in northern Iraq, where there was a battle at the time to liberate the city. It will make a fine hospital. I had overestimated the size of the square in the middle of the town by quite a lot. But it was still big, more than big enough for a hospital. 2 operating theatres, one of them in a truck, an emergency room, and maybe 80 beds. Would have to take care of the cars, of course, overturned, burned, and unruly here and there. Would have to check it for mines, of course, although I'm pretty sure I saw children playing soccer here the other day. Would have to fence it off, of course, or maybe a wall. It's so exposed, and we're only 10 kilometres from Mosul. And maybe block off a few roads, remove the chaotic tangle of down power lines, clean up the broken glass and the shattered remains of the surrounding houses. This square certainly saw some fighting. But other than that, it will make a fine hospital. And I'll read one last poem from that anthology. It's called Iraq, and it was a poem written on the kind of second day that I'd arrived in northern Iraq. And it's about a mass casualty situation, and one of the doctors who I still know very well, who was working with me, an Iraqi doctor who now lives in Australia. He told me this under a black smog sky. The oil burned by the bombers to distract the bombers birthed the plume, crawling, heavy with menace and certainty. He told me, I don't think I can keep this up. But it's only been 2 days and we really need you. And more cars arrived with more victims from the mortar shell. Those that could make it. A young girl, the cousin of a young boy, and a young man a little younger than me, his chest heaving, half quiet, his skin infused with air. And as the black pall of smoke was slowly disguised by the night, and the fires of the sun no longer competed with the oil fires of destruction, we continued to work.
Andy, my goodness, thank you. Thank you beyond words. I'm about to throw this open to everybody. Those of you who've been listening to this extraordinary reading by Fouad and Norbert, and now by Andy, will have many things to ask. The thing that I would like very much to ask both Andy and Fouad, I have a powerful impression with both of you that you suffer from the insufficiency of words, because the experiences are so immense and often so unspeakable, so harrowing. And here you are with just a handful of words trying to convey something of them. How do you deal with that extraordinary insufficiency? Whichever of you wants to go first. And I can see both of you listening to the question, but that doesn't mean it's easy to answer. I'll just sit and listen. Fouad's nodding.
Yeah. I think it's really a hard question because it's my life, you know. Living in the Middle East, in Syria in specific, you know, under 40 years of dictatorship, and then you have to face all this sort of destructive war, bombing everywhere, barrel bombs, shelling. So, and being a doctor in the middle of that sort of death, injuries, and suffering, you can imagine, definitely many doctors in this session or hearing us can imagine when you're just listening to a patient suffering. It's one patient suffering, but now listen to many kids and women and old people that are injured or bleeding, and even the most difficult part, that you are not allowed to treat them. Even more, being arrested or tortured as a medical doctor if you offer medical help to an injuries. And I lost many of my friends, doctors, surgeons, who actually were detained or tortured to death, because they offer that help. So it's sort of, you feel that this is what you need to do and you're not allowed to do, but even more, this is just your entire life and your beloved life. So it's not, and see, I try to help. It's your life, and you spend your life in so continuous suffering. That's what I feel now. I mean, being a chronic traumatized, to say that.
Thank you, Fouad. That's what about you, Andy? Do you have something to say on this?
It is really important to draw that distinction as well, is that so my parents are originally from the Middle East, from Egypt, and from an ethnic minority, but I was born in the UK, raised in Australia. So had a very privileged, very safe upbringing. And Fouad, that's his entire life, and the victims of these wars. I have the privilege of being a Westerner who can I go to these countries for sometimes 6 months, sometimes 1 or 2 months, and then I leave. I have that lucky. I'm lucky. I'm privileged. I'm able to leave. I'm able to resume what I would consider my normal life, which is my life in Sydney, which is one of, where we're in a safe and secure and wealthy country where we're given rights and freedoms. So there is a really big difference there between, what people in these conflict zones are actually experiencing, and someone like Fouad, which is a really much bigger thing and a much more profound, massive, is much more profound and massively affects their entire life. And I think it's really important to pay tribute to that and to acknowledge, that, I'm actually very lucky to be able to have the security of having citizenship of a safe country.
I grew up in London in World War II, experiences with fear there. We were right through the Blitz and through the fire, V1 and V2 bombs, and it left a scar, and I think in my own psyche. I worked in a cholera hospital in what was then East Pakistan, and then at Boston City Hospital, which is very much like a field hospital that MSF runs, with all kinds of trauma and very ill patients. But the thing is, you can't fake it in a poem. So the experiences are there inside of you, and you try to bring it out into words if you're a poet, and the language is not sufficient. This is the best I can say. They're a very rare poet who can make you go goosebumps all over and frightened. So I feel very humbled that I had a chance to work with Fouad, who actually has the language to try to bring it into an English poem.
I very much hope that others will want to join the conversation now. Please don't stand on ceremony.
Can I, Anne speaking, can I just say that although the language may not be enough, do you think perhaps it's the nearest you can get?
It depends on the art form you're thinking about. If you look at the cover of our book, this is an art form that shows chaos and devastation. We had to put our labels on top of it, but the original artwork speaks in a way that poetry tries to. Guernica, Picasso's Guernica does it in painting. Shostakovich in symphony. So there are many different ways to express the dreadful things that one person will do to another. But poetry is what I do my best at that.
Fouad, Andy?
Andy first now.
No, I think that what Norbert said has real truth to it. There's so many ways to tell the stories from any of our life experiences or from kind of such difficult experiences. And, you know, poetry is one way of doing it. And it's a kind of, in some ways, I feel like poetry gives us the license to, with words, be as true as we can to what's going on inside, because there's fewer rules in poetry. There are rules, but there are less rules than in so many other forms of writing. But of course, music and like visual arts also give us avenues to express similar things. And I think that the totality of it is kind of ways we try and make sense of the human experience.
Well, I wish I were a musician or painter, to be honest, you know. I think dealing with color, dealing with notes, you know, could be easier than dealing with words. It always hurt. You know, you don't feel like you struggle sometimes to put all what you feel in one word or few words. And when when I had this experience with Bert about translation, it's another experience of hurt. So, because, you know, if you're a musician, you don't need to translate that, or, you know, painter, you can just see. But for writing, whether novel, you know, poetry, for writing, it's always you struggle of you dealing with words. But later, if you want to translate that, it's super difficult, you know, talking about translating your feeling that sometimes you wrote it in one day. And that's why we actually in this, with this great work with Bert, that we didn't translate, to be honest. We worked trying to write an English poem, you know, so there are sort of transformation more than translation.
It's Wade here. Can I make a couple of comments, Michael?
Please do.
I slightly disagree with some of the comments. These poems from these two poets are extremely powerful, and they convey in very vivid terms the depth of emotion and the devastation that these various places suffer. They do raise some goose pimples, and in particular, I enjoyed the Arabic. It's extremely well presented in a very a strong and intellectual form of Arabic, which is the poetic presentation. As far as my namesake is concerned, his description of camps in Sudan are far more powerful than what you would see in a documentary on television, where they show the horrors of and suffering in these camps. But I think his poetry has conveyed that very vividly and in a very powerful way. So thank you.
Wade, may I say, I hope you didn't misunderstand when I talked of the insufficiency of words. I was talking about the sense I had that both of these poets were struggling to find words adequate to conveying the enormity of the experiences they were going through and witnessing and so on. Yeah. I didn't mean that the resulting poems were not up to the job. That was not at all what I meant.
No, it's not what I meant either. So I'm sorry if
Oh, good. Okay. Fine.
if I didn't express it well. I just thought they were extremely powerful, particularly, and the translation was very good from Arabic to English. And sometimes a lot is lost in translation, as you know, but in fact, it wasn't. It was an accurate representation of the Arabic version of the poetry. Thank you.
I should like very much to encourage others to come in on this, because I can see a lot of muted microphones still, which is all very tactful of you, but I'm sure that, I mean, I could see the chat conversation going with a lot of very moved and applauding comments. Would anybody like to just come in and speak to the poets? This is the chance.
Yes, I would, please, Michael. I would like to, if I may, say to Andrew, who said that he leaves a very safe place in Sydney and he has a very privileged life, and I commend that. But to actually go to the war zones, I just think is commendable. And I think you're putting yourself down, Andrew, by saying that you can go back to a safe home in Sydney in the same way that Fouad carries on, even though he's seen his fellow doctors tortured and murdered for trying to keep others alive. I think your words are so, they come across because they're not highfalutin in language, they're just telling us exactly how it is. And that to me is the impact exactly of what you're both doing. And all I can say is thank you to both of you. And Andrew, please don't put yourself down by saying that you can escape back to Sydney, because you have to go back and you have to gather your senses and then you go back again. And, you know, thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
And I think that Jane wanted to come in with a question. Jane McLaughlin, are you there?
Yes, I am. And again, I'd like to say thank you for an incredibly moving experience. And it will take me some time to process and think about this. You're talking at the moment, I think, almost entirely to poets and writers. And obviously you have a wide audience for your poetry. Who do you think should read these poems? Who would you like to hear them?
Interesting question. I mean,
Politicians.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, to be honest, never thinking about that. But I think that, yeah, who wish you, people like you, because I know that poetry now are, you know, has less and less, you know, sort of audience, and it's difficult, of course, to feel that. You know, writing poetry is something that you write first to yourself, but you definitely, I would like to have my poems read by many, but realistically, I know that very few will read poetry. Yeah, but you know, I dedicated my book, if I could say that, to my home city, Aleppo, which is, I think I will never go back there with this current situation now, and to their people. So I wish now that people in Aleppo can read this book.
I think it's got to be said that after every great catastrophe, there's a great outwelling of poems. Some of them pretty good, and there's a great interest in poetry by people who have not read poetry before. So poetry does something for the humanity, the common humanity, when we need to come together during a great crisis. One would like, of course, that it'd be there all the time, but realistically, poets know that we're a small group of people that like to read to each other and read each other's poems. But poetry has a way of healing ourselves. And you go back to people like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, who wrote in great crisis of the American Civil War, and we still read them. They still speak to us.
So can I say something?
Claire, please do.
I don't know if I'm before or after Anne, but I think Anne spoke, or a Anne spoke.
Oh, I'm a different Anne, but go ahead first.
Oh, sorry, Anne. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Congratulations, Fouad, and everybody. This is fantastic. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering the war in Syria for many, many years, and other conflicts, and of course everything else in journalism also one way or another comes around to trauma as well. So I have a comment and a question, and one is the comment is that I think when you talked about the inadequacy of words, I was thinking about how much I struggle with the inadequacy of journalism, you know, even as a form to like encompass everything that it should tell, and that sometimes without like stepping away from the responsibility to be verified and factual, I would try to use a little bit of poetry, or at least hear a little bit of poetry, you know, in telling a story, or describing a place or a thing or a person or a situation. And then I also think like poetry does something that that written journalism has trouble with, but maybe you hear it a little bit in podcasts or audio narrative journalism. Poetry can also use silence to express that problem. So that's something a wonderful sort of tool that poetry has. My question is, and maybe I missed the very beginning, so it might have already been discussed, but you know, since this is all about doctors as poets, and there's such a long tradition of doctors as poets, I wonder if it's the existence of trauma in the normal work of a doctor that has led like sort of a disproportionate amount of doctors to explore poetry, and what do you think is the relationship between between the kind of trauma and the way you deal with it as a doctor compared to the way you deal with it as a poet?
Maybe I could come in there. I trained in Boston as a surgeon, and Boston City Hospital was one of the places where my teachers came from. And it's now a very fancy medical center with, you know, new buildings, but it doesn't sanitize the horror that one has. But the thing that's different is that, first of all, unlike Fouad, I'm expected to be there within 8 minutes of a call, not, you know, sent to prison or tortured because I'm treating someone. And you do very dispassionately take care of a person until the end, and then you can relax and suddenly feel the tremendous humanity, you know, whether somebody's wounds are still bleeding because they're still alive, or that they stop bleeding, and it just makes you want to vomit. It's a very visceral response, and Andy's poetry to me was visceral. I mean, I actually felt slightly nauseated and
Can I come in, Claire? I know that Mary Mulholland is waiting to ask a question as well.
Yeah.
Before I go to Mary, can I just ask whether Andy or Fouad or Norbert wants to come back on anything that's just been said by the last two speakers?
Well, for Anne, I have to quote Carlos Williams, our wonderful doctor poet, who said, "You can't get any news from what's in poetry, but every day people die for lack of what is there."
Mm-hmm. Yep. Fouad?
Yeah. first, how wonderful to see you, and so happy that you're here. So yeah, I mean, I think I practiced surgery for almost like 25 years before moving to Lebanon and working in public health. And so being close with the, people try, poets try to imagine the internal life or the, of any human being. Surgeons, they see that literally, you're in literally, organs are something you touch and you smell. So that's sort of, something, the body there is sort of something very, very internal, it's not like it's something from outside. And also you deal, as mentioned, you deal always with suffering, and this is another issue of connection between, poetry, which is also about, unfortunately, about suffering, and the body that's very close. So I cannot imagine that I have another profession than being doctor.
Michael, if I could respond to Mary's question, which is...
we haven't had it yet.
Well, we haven't had it on the chat. Yeah, Mary could ask it out loud.
Okay, I was just going to say thank you very much for these incredibly moving poems. And I just wondered whether you were always drawn to writing poetry, or whether this form resulted as from your experiences, that it felt the best way to express what you've been through in your various in these various experiences, which is so troubling.
I think in my case, Mary, I think I always thought I was a poet, but I never was. But when I was working in Egypt in the 1980s on the diarrheal disease wards, introducing oral rehydration therapy to Egypt and subsequently to the world, we saw an awful lot of terrible, terrible situations. And not to put too fine a point on it, it made me wonder what was it that I could say about what I was experiencing. And it was just about that time that I started writing poetry and got interested in poetry as an art form, as a craft. So that perhaps it was the experience in the hospitals in Egypt, pediatric clinics as well, that finally pushed me into doing poetry.
Sure, thank you. Was it the same for Andrew?
I think I had a similar experience. I started writing poetry during the war when I was working in Iraq 3 years ago. So, and it was kind of in a direct response to some of the experiences that I had there. So it was kind of, yeah, maybe like Bert says, that maybe, I'd always thought about poetry and loved poetry and was interested in it. I thought, maybe I would write it one day, but it never seemed to really happen. And then suddenly it seems like such an important thing to be doing, and like something that made a lot of sense to kind of to be able to communicate some of the things that I've been experiencing. So it was definitely the kind of two are deeply intertwined.
Andy, may I just ask you a follow-on question there? When you were reading the truly harrowing poem about the girl that you've called Kalia, I kept thinking of Wilfred Owen's way of rationalizing what he was doing with words. Because, of course, when you're confronted with experience like that, you don't want to do what poetry does. You don't want to mess around with forms and words and language, because the experience is beyond all that fiddle, to use Marianne Moore's phrase. However, you have now a poem there. It is overwhelmingly harrowing to experience as a listener. Would his way of putting it, that the poetry is in the pity, that was Wilfred Owen's way of putting it, would that suit you as an aesthetic? Because your language is very spare, isn't it? You simply tell it as it is. You don't do any of those tricks that poets are so in love with. You don't draw any attention to yourself as poet. you just focus on the terribleness of the experience that someone else is going through. So the poetry and the pity seems to me. How do you feel?
Look, I mean, I think just as a side note about that poem, it's interesting, but that's the first time I've ever read that poem out loud. And I think I didn't quite appreciate until I was doing it. Really, I mean, it was making me feel quite stressed out, to be honest. I wrote it a while ago and I haven't read it out before. So I do apologize, by the way, if anyone did find that a little bit too confronting. I probably should have given a warning before that. Look, I think in some ways it's a reasonable, I mean, I never think about it in those terms, Michael, I guess, you know, because I guess when I write, I just am writing to try and kind of delineate the experience that I somehow interfaced with. And really, in a sense, that wasn't really my experience, that poem. It's the experience of that young girl who was just kind of dealing with that immense amount of suffering with so much kind of, she was just so matter of fact about it. So I guess in a sense, I kind of, that description does resonate with me, but it's not necessarily my my intention or my thoughts, I guess. It's one of those things where the kind of the product of what that poem is probably just my interpretation of that girl's experience.
Any more questions? We should gradually think of winding down, but there's time for some more questions, I think.
I have a question for Fouad, if that's okay.
Yeah, please do.
So I'm talking from Hanover, New Hampshire. I'm a scholar of Arabic poetry at Dartmouth College, and I was wondering, Aleppo is so present in the poems and in the title. I was wondering if it's also present. I mean, your language, your Arabic language, your poetic language is so crisp and also in some sense spare to what we're used to from Arabic poetry. And I was wondering if you have sort of local sources in terms of the language that come from Aleppo, or what kind of poetic models are you sort of corresponding with as an Arab poet?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question. Although I write in what's called Fusha or formal Arabic, which is different from the dialect in Aleppo and any other city, but you're right. I at least in a few of the poems that were read today had that touch from the language of the Aleppian language itself. Something about the using places in Aleppo, or even the structure of the language. I felt it later, actually. I didn't mean it when I wrote these poems, but later I saw that, yes, there are some words from the city. It's not a big surprise, being Aleppian myself, but also I think specifically because I was talking about this huge suffering of this city, that this very ancient city that's now almost half destroyed, and that feeling that maybe you've never been able to see it again. Maybe I revive that. I revive the city in the poems and maybe more in the language itself. I wish, if that could happen one day. Thank you for the question.
Michael, can I make a comment to Andy about his I really, although it's very powerful, and he told it the way it is, it's actually very difficult to imagine how harrowing that practice is. And we know in this country it's illegal and people are prosecuted. As a surgeon, I never could imagine, how mutilating that is. And the fact that I've heard it, I can understand why this is illegal and immoral and just a terrible thing to do. So if it wasn't as descriptive and as powerful as that, it wouldn't have conveyed the horrors of the practice.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Absolutely right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with that too.
Yep. For sure.
Could I ask a question, please?
Please do. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, my name is Sarah. I'm a medical student and I'm doing a master's in global health just now. And the poetry was amazing. So thank you all for your work. I just wanted to ask if either of you have read any of the poems that you've written to anyone that you've written them about, and kind of what their response, if you have done that, has been.
I might I start by answering that because I actually had that experience about one of the poems that I wrote about that German pediatrician, which was recently published. I wrote that some time ago, some months ago, but just about 3 days ago, I sent it to her because it was going to be published. And so I thought she should know that it was about her. It's not clearly about her, obviously about her if you read it, but you know, that it was written about her. And so she would never know unless I kind of told her. So I did. And yeah, I think he really appreciated it. It was, you know, it was a difficult situation for both of us looking back at that time. And it was hard. And I think we both really suffered emotionally. And I think she kind of appreciated that I had noticed her strength, which maybe, you know, like puts a, looking back on it, kind of puts a positive spin on what was a very difficult experience. Yeah.
What Andi just said about noticing her strength somehow for me embodies this whole event of poetry reading and what's been read and what's been commented on. So thank you very much.
I think it feels as if we may have come to the end of our evening. Thank you very much to Fouad, to Norbert, and to Andi. They have given us so much to feel and think about. And this is deeply valuable experience that is packed into these poems and so well conveyed. All of us have a real commitment to poetry, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You're all deeply compassionate people. We know that from not just tonight's event, but past events as well. The books by Fouad and Norbert, Once Upon a Time in Aleppo, and by Andi, Winter in Northern Iraq, are available through the Hippocrates website as well, or indeed directly to the poets if you're in touch with them, as I think some of you are. I think that's all I need to say, except the next of our Poems to Live For events will be in November. It will be the launch event of our retrospective anthology collecting all the major prize-winning poems from the first 10 years of the Hippocrates Prize. But for this evening, if you'd just like briefly all of you to unmute yourselves and challenge the bandwidth, I'd like a quick round of applause if we could have it for Fouad, Norbert, and Andi. Thank you so much to all of you.
Wonderful, thank you. Really
appreciate it. Thank you all. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Really, thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic.
Thank you.